بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. قال الله تعالى في كتاب العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. So last week we continued our discussion on some of the persecution that the companions faced during the early days of Islam and the da'wah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one of the main categories that we discussed were especially those who were under bondage, those who were considered slaves in the time of Mecca. And in a weird way, this was a certain category of those Muslims who were persecuted. And in a weird way, they were kind of fortunate to be slaves, because as we talked about last week, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh was literally a hero and would go around and find any slave that was a Muslim that is being persecuted and would make sure that their freedom is purchased. And he would do this in an abundant manner, and so many individuals were freed because of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Now, after that, there was a second category of those who were not slaves, and their condition, their situation was very, very bad, because no one could save them, no one could set them free. And one example of this is the family of Yasir radiallahu anhu, Al-Yasir. Al-Yasir, Yasir radiallahu anhu, he moved from Yemen. And if you guys may remember from early on, what we talked about in terms of Yemen and the geopolitics of the Arabian Peninsula at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, Yemen was a very poor area. There was not much wealth going on there. There was not much a business going on there. There was not much, trade that was going on there. So it was very common for Yemenis to kind of try to move to different areas of the Arabian Peninsula and try to find work there. Mecca was abundant with business. So Al-Yasir decided to move to Mecca. But in order to move to Mecca, you kind of have to gain citizenship. And the only way to do that is to broker a deal with someone from the Makhzum tribe, right? Which is the tribe of Abu Jahl. And so Al-Yasir decided to broker this deal. And for a very long time, Yasir worked mostly menial jobs, but he was happy. He had an income. He got married to a slave woman by the name of Sumayya. They lived very humbly with their son for years, Ammar. And then when Ammar bin Yasir was a young man, he accepted Islam. And he would sneak out at night and sit with the Prophet Muhammad and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the Prophet and other companions in Darul Arqam. Now his parents started noticing that there was something going on. He had these sneaking habits. He would go out in the middle of the night. He would disappear for long periods of time. So they asked Ammar, what's going on? And so when Ammar bin Yasir, he comes clean to his parents. And his parents were devastated. They were devastated. Because they didn't really know much about Islam, but what they were worried most about were the repercussions from becoming Muslim. Because they were seeing that people in Mecca are becoming Muslim, and they're being heavily persecuted and tortured for it. And so Yasir and Sumayya were concerned for Ammar because of the opposition that he would face because of his Islam, not necessarily because they didn't believe in the message. As a matter of fact, it was the opposite. Ammar bin Yasir used that opportunity to give his parents da'wah. So he gave them the Prophet's message. He gave them the message of the Quran. And so Yasir and Sumayya, they became so deeply affected by this da'wah, by this message, that they told Ammar, take us to the Prophet Muhammad. So Ammar bin Yasir, excited, he takes his two parents to the Prophet Muhammad. They meet the Prophet. They hear from the Prophet directly about Islam, and they accept Islam. Now, when Abu Jahl found out that they were Muslim, and because he was under the Makhzum tribe, which is where Yasir was also the tribe that he brokered a deal with to gain citizenship, there was nobody to protect Yasir, Sumayya, and Ammar radiallahu anhum from Abu Jahl. So he captured all three of them, and he would torture them, and he would beat them, and he would do that in front of everybody. He tied up the family to poles. He would leave them standing there for days. He would torture the family members in front of each other. So it's not just psychological torture, but it's also, or not just a physical torture, but it's also psychological torture. Seeing the people that you love the most going through intense pain and suffering. And this went on for a very, very long time. Until one day, Abu Jahl decides to read inappropriate lines of poetry to Sumayya, saying very vile things to her about, things that he's going to do and etc. And so Sumayya had reached her limit, and so she spoke back to him. And she said some things back to him, standing up for herself. And Abu Jahl, he takes Sumayya radiallahu anha, and he throws her to the ground, and he takes his spear, and he kills her. And he kills her in a way that is extremely violent. If you want to find out for yourself how, you can look it up. I'm not going to say. But he did something extremely disgusting in order to kill her. And he did it in front of her husband and her son. And so then there are two aspects to this and what happens. The number one thing is that, first of all, we find out that Abu Jahl is a vile man. And we've known this for a very, very long time, but this just proves it even further. But second, Sumayya radiallahu anha, she has a special honor in our deen. She has a special virtue in our deen, where she is now considered the first martyr of Islam. The first martyr of the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Which means what? Every martyr after her is following the sunnah of Sumayya radiallahu anha. Everybody that dies for the sake of the deen is following the sunnah of this woman. And as we know from many narrations, whoever starts a good action gets the reward of that good action for everybody that does it after him or after her. So in this case, Sumayya radiallahu anha, every martyr of our religion, Sumayya radiallahu anha is getting a share in that reward. Every single one. Everyone that we see in Palestine, in Sudan, in Kashmir, in China with the Uyghurs, everywhere that we see people who are holding firm on their deen or they're being killed because of it, Sumayya radiallahu anha is the person that they are following. Sumayya radiallahu anha is the person that is getting the reward for that as well. So it's a special honor. And so at that same time, Yasir and Ammar are being tortured as well. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would see them being tortured and he could not do anything. And one thing that we're going to talk about extensively. Sorry, are we good? Okay. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties earlier, but we should be good now. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would see them being tortured and he could not do anything. So the only thing he was able to say was to the family of Yasir, Sabrun ya ala Yasir, فَإِنَّ مَوْعِدُكُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. Have patience, O family of Yasir, because Jannah is indeed promised to you. Jannah is indeed promised to you. And one narration says, Abshiru ala Yasir. Not just be patient, but be happy. Be happy. Receive the good news that Jannah is your promised place. Now, I am going to dedicate next week's session to discuss the wisdoms of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to have a passive resistance during his time in Mecca. What was the wisdom behind that? Now, it's very clear based on the narrations and very clear about the Prophet ﷺ, how he would make dua against the oppressors, that had it been up to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, maybe Allah Ta'ala alam if he would have taken a passive or a more physical approach, but Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala commanded the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to take a passive approach for the first 13 years, and we will discuss the wisdoms and why that was the case. But so in this moment, the Prophet ﷺ can't do anything. He can't do anything physical. He can't go and step in and hurt Abu Jahl in any way and protect the family of Yasir. So the Prophet ﷺ instead, what he does is he promises them a place in paradise. And this is the beauty of our deen. This is the beauty of our deen, that we find good in everything. We find optimism in everything. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in a beautiful narration, "Ajaban li amri al-mu'min." that the matter of the believer is very, very strange. Inna amrahu kulluhu khayr. That every affair of a believer is good. وَلَيْسَ ذَاكَ وَلَيْسَ ذَاكَ لِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا لِمُؤْمِنٍ. That this is only in the case of a believer. Only in the case of a believer where every matter that they face is good. إِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ سَرَّاءُ شَكَرَ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. That any time a good thing happens to a believer, a delightful thing happens to a believer, he thanks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and thus there is good for him in it. When أصابته ضراء صبر فكان خيرا له. But anytime there is an affliction or he gets into trouble and he shows patience and he shows resignation and he endures it, then there is good for him in it as well. So this is the affair of the believer, that no matter what difficulties we go through, there is always good in that. Alhamdulillah. Now, there are also certain realities in life, as we see in this situation, where there is very little to be done, or maybe even nothing can be done except for dua. Right? One of the beautiful things about our religion is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made sure that the most powerful weapon that we have is one that can never be restricted. No matter what position you are in, no matter what state you are in, you are able to use your most powerful weapon, which is dua. This is beautiful. So oftentimes we hear the kind of common trope where the bare minimum that you can do is dua. And in a way, it's kind of true, but it's also the best thing that we can do. It's bare minimum in the sense that everybody's able to do it, and there's no excuse for nobody not to do it. But we also don't belittle it and say that this is, oh, we can only make dua, what else are we going to do? No. Because Allah can always do way more than we all can. And Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he actually said that the Muslims from the east to the west of the earth, they have one heart. They are loyal to Allah, they are loyal to His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and His faithful worshippers. And they are hostile to the enemies of Allah, and they're hostile to the enemies of the Messenger and the enemies of His faithful worshippers. And that their sincere hearts, meaning them all the Muslims together, and righteous supplications are the army that cannot be defeated and the soldiers that will never fail. They will always be victorious party until the day of resurrection. This is what our deen is. Our deen does not allow for us to be hopeless. قُلْ يَا عِبَادِي الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. Oh, say to the Prophet, say to my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many mufassirun say about this verse, about this ayah, it is haram. It is an act of disbelief to lose hope in Allah. That's what our religion is. It does not allow for someone to ever lose hope. Always remain optimistic. And that's the power of dua. That's the power of dua that we have. And the power of dua as well is it teaches us how to be desperate. It teaches us how to leave things in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ibrahim alayhi salam, after he built the Kaaba, the house in which billions and billions of people across history are going to pray at and are going to make tawaf around. And at this time, it was just him and his son. Afterwards, he raises his hand in dua and he makes a series of duas. One of the duas that he made was what? رَبَّنَا وَبَعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ وَيَعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. The dua that he made was, oh Allah, I ask you to raise amongst these people a messenger, which will recite to them your book, your revelation, teach them the book and the wisdom, and to purify them. And indeed, you are the Almighty and the All-Wise. So this dua is talking about what? It's talking about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the only prophet after Ibrahim alayhi salam, from the lineage of Ibrahim alayhi salam. There's Ishaq and Ismail. All the other prophets come from Ishaq,
And the only prophet that comes from the lineage of Ismail alayhi salam is who? The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So this is talking about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the only prophet to come from this people, the tribe in Mecca. But does anybody know the time gap between Ibrahim alayhi salam and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Anybody know? It's not a rhetorical question I'm asking. How many years? Historians predict about 4,000 to 5,000 years. So, my question to us all, as a reflection question, is if the friend of Allah, Khalilullah, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran and says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took him as a friend, took 5,000 years for his dua to be accepted, why are we being so hasty? Why are we being so hasty? Why do we see our du'as not being accepted the past 3 months with all the geopolitics that are going on around the globe? And we're saying, why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not accepting my dua? Like, everything in its due time. Everything in Allah's perfect timing. Now, Yasir radiallahu anh, he was also eventually killed. Some narrations say that Yasir radiallahu anh eventually died because of the prolonged torture, while other narrations said that he was just completely beside himself after he witnessed his wife being murdered in front of him, that he started to scream and fight and squirm and try to set himself free. And so what ended up happening was Abu Jahl threw Yasir on the ground and began to kick him and stab him and hurt him until he died. Now Ammar, a young man, has just witnessed both of his parents being murdered in front of him. And he was tied to a pole, so he couldn't do anything. And so Ammar radiallahu anh, he was trying to do everything he can to set himself free, but Abu Jahl said, you will not be free until you curse the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and you praise our idols, Allat and Al-Uzza. And he hung on as long as he could. And at one point, Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh actually came to Abu Jahl and said, I know he's not a slave, but let me free them anyways. I'll give you whatever you want. And Abu Jahl said, no, not this time. Not this time. You're not going to fool me this time. And so he hung on as long as he could, and eventually Ammar radiallahu anh, he broke, and he did what Abu Jahl said. He cursed the Prophet ﷺ, and he praised Allat and Uzza, and he was released. And when this happened, the torturers of Ammar felt like some type of victory. They had achieved some type of sort of sick victory. That they took the dignity from Ammar radiallahu anh, which is the same sick mentality that we see when people destroy a school and then walk into that school and write intimidating or humiliating comments or taunting comments onto the whiteboard, onto the wall. You just bombed the children's school and you feel like you are victorious? You just bombed a random citizen's home and you feel like you're victorious and you're going to make TikTok videos mocking it? Are you insane? So Ammar radiallahu anh, he could not stop crying. He was hurt that he said what he said. He literally crawled to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was bloodied. He was emotional. He was a spiritual wreck. He felt immense guilt because of what he had just said about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to his torturers. And so he cried to the Prophet and said, Ya Rasulullah, I messed up. I messed up big time. They told me to say this and they'll let me free, and I said this. And so the Prophet asked Ammar, Ya Ammar, what was in your heart when you said it? What was in your heart when you said it? And Ammar radiallahu anh, he replies, I swear by Allah, I have never believed in Allah or you any more than I do now. My iman was stronger than it has ever been before. In just that moment, I just felt overwhelmed. And in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed an ayah validating the iman of Ammar. That when you're overwhelmed or you're tortured or you're torn to shreds, and at that time something comes out from your tongue that is not in your heart, then Allah understands. He understands and He forgives you. Your iman is not invalidated. من كفر بالله من بعد إيمانه إلا من أكره وقلبه مطمئن بالإيمان. That whoever disbelieves in Allah after their belief, except those who are forced while their hearts are firm in faith. This is revealed directly about Ammar radiallahu anhu. And then, following that revelation, the Prophet Muhammad actually told his companions, and he told Ammar that if they repeat what they did to you, you will repeat what you said to them. And if any one of you end up in this situation, say what these wild dogs want to hear so that they can escape their grip, escape their torture, and you can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala freely. And later on, Ammar bin Yasir, he migrates with about a dozen other Muslims to Abyssinia, where he would then meet the Prophet Muhammad in Medina years later. But the beautiful thing here is that the Prophet Muhammad he understood that everyone had their own threshold. And just because everyone has their own threshold does not mean that one's iman is stronger than the other. It's easy to judge Ammar in an air-conditioned room. It's easy to judge a resistance movement when you make millions of dollars a year and you are a fancy talk TV host. It's easy to do that. But once you've faced their oppression, you've faced their persecution, and you can still say the same, it's not going to be possible. After 1 second in their situation, you will immediately understand why they did what they had to do. There's another companion by the name of Abu Fuqayha, who was a slave of Umayyah bin Khalaf. When Bilal radiallahu anhu was freed, Safwan and his father tortured Abu Fuqayha nearly to his death. So there was an incident where they were torturing and beating Abu Fuqayha when a bug walked by his body. And the son Safwan points out at the bug, and he said to Abu Fuqayha, "Is this your Lord coming to help you?" And Abu Fuqayha replied, he's like, "No, my Rabb is your Rabb, and the Rabb of everything else." And this response infuriated Safwan to the point that he started to strangle him. "How dare you talk back to me like this?" And Abu Fuqayha fell unconscious. And when Abu Fuqayha became unconscious, Safwan and Umayyah got up and they walked away. Because at this point they thought that Abu Fuqayha was dead. But Abu Fuqayha eventually he regained consciousness, and later comes who? Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu again, and he purchased the freedom of Abu Fuqayha. Another companion by the name of Khabbab ibn al-Arat. No man was tortured like this man. And he said the fat of my back would be used to extinguish coal. So he would lay down on a hot bed of coal. They would lay him down on a hot bed of coal, and the fat on his back was the only thing that would extinguish the heat of the coal. And so one day, some of the people that came later in Islam were boasting about their sacrifices for Islam. And so Khabbab ibn al-Arat, he's an old man now at this point. And he's kind of laughing and he's enjoying these people talking about the sacrifices that they've made for Islam. "Oh, I gave up Netflix for 1 week. Oh, I boycotted Starbucks and McDonald's for a whole year. That's the sacrifice that I made." So Khabbab ibn al-Arat, what did he do? He lifts up his shirt and he shows them the sacrifice. And the people there said it was like craters were in his back. What happened was that he was captured and he was kidnapped and he was sold into slavery as a young boy. And so he was sold to a man from the tribe of Khuza'. When he accepted Islam, he was also tortured. And he eventually gained his freedom, but he was a huge inspiration to the Sahaba, especially Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. When he was Khalifa, there were moments where Umar ibn Khattab felt extremely overwhelmed. The Muslim empire grew more under Umar ibn Khattab than probably any other ruler in history of the Islamic empire. So his rule was very vast, and it was very quick, and it was very large. So now you have thousands and thousands of Muslims coming into the deen, and you have to govern all these different countries and all these different places that you have just conquered, and all the different non-Muslims that are there that you're trying to establish good relationships with and good ties and good contracts with, so that everybody's treated fairly in those lands, so that nobody does what other people have been doing to Muslims and trying to execute any people that aren't like them. And so there were moments in the life of Umar ibn Khattab where it was just a lot. He would feel very overwhelmed. You know what he would do in those situations? He would go to Khabbab ibn al-Arat and he say, "Show me your back." And as soon as Khabbab ibn al-Arat show him his back, he say, "This is why I do what I do. I'm good now. I'll make as much sacrifices as I need. I will be overwhelmed every day because of your sacrifice." Now, eventually, the persecution of Muslims wasn't just limited to those who were seen as lower class at that time, which Islam came to liberate, such as women or slaves, or those who were in low status in terms of society. But then it actually eventually ended up growing to include the men and the elite as well. Uthman ibn Affan, who was a very rich, honorable, wealthy man, he himself was also tied up by his own uncle. And he said to his nephew, "We will not let you go until you renounce your religion." Uthman ibn Affan, he refused. And he was able to escape from the capture of his uncle. We talked a couple weeks ago about Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and his mother. How his mother did a hunger strike, saying that I will not eat or drink anything until you denounce your religion of Islam. And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas says, I can't denounce the religion of Islam, but he stood by the side of his mother and begged her to eat and drink until she eventually felt a lot of weakness and had to eat or drink. Which is a beautiful lesson for us all. That when it comes to the way that we treat parents or treat anybody in our life, actually, it doesn't need to be just parents, but we treat all of them with the utmost respect, with love. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas would not leave the side of his mother, even though his mother was telling him to disobey Allah. And he would treat her with the utmost respect while not disobeying Allah. Meaning, I will obey my parents until it comes to the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this applies across the board for everybody. And I say this because, unfortunately, there is a sentiment that sometimes happens in our ummah about just clear-cut obeying people and just trusting their wisdom. So obey the rulers. Obey the Arab leaders. They know what they're doing. But the reality is, this is actually antithesis to the Quran and Sunnah and the actions of the Salaf and the actions of the Sahaba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He Himself says what? Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. Oh, those who believe, obey Allah, obey His Messenger, and those in authority amongst you. Okay. But let's look at the Arabic for a second. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. Allah could have said, Ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul wa ati'u uli amri minkum. But He doesn't. He leaves out the ati'a from the ulil amri minkum, meaning what? That obeying those in authority amongst you is contingent on the previous two. That if they are not clearly trying to obey Allah and His Messenger, there's no obeying there. There's no obeying there. And it also says, فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. That if you disagree on anything, meaning disagreement, you can disagree with your ruler. You can disagree with the leader. Refer it to Allah and His Messenger. And then see who is the one closer to Allah and His Messenger, and that's what we're going to go with. If you truly believe in Allah on the last day, and this is the best and the fairest resolution. The Prophet ﷺ, he says in narration, السمع والطاعة على المرء المسلم فيما أحب وكره. That the Muslim is required to hear and obey in that which he likes and dislikes. ما لم يؤمر بمعصية, unless he was commanded to sin. فإذا أمر بمعصية فلا سمع ولا طاعة. That if he is commanded to disobey or sin, then there is no such thing as hearing or obeying. And so Ubadah ibn as-Samit, he said that we gave our pledge to Allah's messenger to hear and obey our leaders while active and otherwise, in times of ease, in times of difficulty. Even if we were deprived of our due shares and not dispute in matters with its rightful people, then the Prophet ﷺ said, إِلَّا أَن تَرَوْا كُفْرًا بَوَاحًا عِنْدَكُمْ فِيهِ مِنَ اللَّهِ بُرْهَانٍ. Except when you witness clear contradiction, clear kufr, about which you have clear proof from Allah. Right? So it's a conditional statement. We don't have a blanket worship the leaders no matter what. We just don't have it. And if you look at the lives of the companions themselves, this becomes clear as day. When Ali radiallahu anh, he himself was Amir al-Mu'mineen. He was the Khalifa. He was the ruler of all the Muslims. He was walking into the shop and he saw his armor that was stolen. It was previously stolen. And he sees a Jewish man selling that armor. And he says, hold up, that's my armor. And Jewish man says, no, that's not your armor. That's my armor. I got it fair and square and I'm selling it. Ali radiallahu anh takes him to court. His court. Muslim judge, Muslim qadi. And the Muslim judge tells Ali, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, do you have proof that this is yours? Because I can't just rule. I can't just say like this is what it is. What did Ali radiallahu anh say? He said, I am Amir al-Mu'mineen, you have to listen to me. You can't disagree with me on anything that I say or do. And if you do, I'll arrest you, I'll send you to prison. Now rule in my favor. He said, no, I don't have proof. And so the judge, he said, sorry, I can't rule in your favor. This armor belongs to the Jewish man until you can prove that this is yours. And the Jewish man witnessed this and he was like, what kind of religion is this? Where the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, can be ruled against? And he accepted Islam on the spot. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, when he was Amir al-Mu'mineen, when he was the Khalifa, he received a lot of complaints from the men in the area, saying that some of the women's mahar are too high. Right? I feel like a lot of people can relate to that. Some of the women's mahar are too high. So Umar ibn Khattab, he gives a khutbah, he addresses the people, and he says, you know, do not be excessive in the dowry. And there's one narration, a weaker narration, that says that he actually set an actual price number, right? He set a specific price, but that's a weaker narration. But the more authentic narration just says that just says do not be excessive in the dowry. A woman stands up and says, oh Omar, this is not for you to decide. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, وَآتَيْتُمْ إِحْدَاهُنَّ قِنْطَارًا, that you gave one of them a great amount. And so Umar radiallahu anhu said, indeed, a woman has disputed Umar and she has defeated him. Because he was humble. If you're not humble enough to accept criticism when you're in a leadership position, then you didn't deserve to be in that position in the first place. That position is not for you because you're in a position of serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not your ego. Hussein radiallahu anhu, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, which the Prophet said that he is a flower to me in this world. Talking about Hassan and Hussein, he said, these are my two sweet flowers in this world. Hussein radiallahu anh refused the appointment of Yazid as Khalifa. I refuse to recognize him because he is a clear and he is a public transgressor of the deen. He refused it. Where would we be if Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal did not stand up to his oppressors and say that I will not obey your rule because you are trying to change the deen and you are trying to change the people's aqidah and the way that we view the Quran. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal he single-handedly saved the deen from becoming something that was extremely twisted. And he did it because he refused to obey the ruler in that situation. All the big names that we know, Ibn Taymiyyah, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, Imam Bukhari, all these people, they were not popular when they were alive. They were persecuted heavily, and they stood up against a lot of oppression. And it's in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted their names to be honored today. That they're in our bookshelves as household names. When they died with nobody knowing their name or nobody respecting them at that time. And so this is what's clear. So the reality is the mentality of, based on the Quran and Sunnah and the actions of our Sahaba and the actions of our great Imams that we have seen across history, this blanket statement of follow the leaders and the rulers, they know better, they're more wise than you, that's actually the bid'ah. That is the bid'ah. Show me a ruler who is outright righteous and he promises to abide by the Quran and Sunnah, and in that process he makes mistakes, no problem, because there's never going to be a perfect ruler. If you want a perfect leader, unfortunately, he passed away to the next life 1400 years ago, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Every person after that made mistakes in their lifetime as leaders. And so every leader is going to make a mistake and they're going to commit some type of injustice, but show me one who was willing to listen, willing to be criticized, willing to improve, willing to be humble, willing to serve. I will obey, I will follow that man 100% till the grave. Until then, I don't want to hear, trust the wisdom of Shakira shaking her hips in Riyadh. Until then, I don't want to hear, trust the wisdom of tens of millions of dollars being thrown away in your New Year's Eve firework party while your brothers and sisters in Gaza are dying, and you're at the same time funding massacres of civilians in Sudan. I don't want to hear, trust the wisdom of the rulers of opening up bars and strip clubs in Muslim lands. That to me is a clear bid'ah, it's a ridiculous statement. It's not going to happen. Now, amongst the companions that were also persecuted, even though they were of the elite, one of them was a person by the name of Mus'ab bin Umair. Mus'ab bin Umair was a celebrity of his time. Right? He was very young, he was handsome, he was wealthy, he was very well dressed. He was GQ to the max. Now, if he was at a party, you knew that this was the place that you wanted to be. He was the most popular guy in the town. Now, when he accepted Islam, his mother tied him up, right? His mother tortured him, telling him to renounce Islam. Mus'ab would not relent. Mus'ab bin Umair went to the Prophet ﷺ in his humble condition. She threw him out in the street. She stripped him of his beautiful, wealthy clothing and threw him out in the street. Now he's nothing. All his wealth is gone. Everything is gone and taken away from him because of his Islam. Mus'ab bin Umair, he went to the Prophet ﷺ in this humble condition. The Prophet ﷺ made sure that he got clothes. He took care of him. And Mus'ab later on, he becomes one of the first ambassadors of Islam. Actually, the first ambassador of Islam. When he went to represent Islam in a small city by the name of Yathrib, which will later be known as Medina, the most beloved city to every Muslim alive. He was like the teacher assistant of the Prophet ﷺ. He was like the TA of the Prophet. Right? He would teach the Prophet, the deen. He would preach Islam to the citizens of Yathrib, which will later be known as Medina. Over the course of a year, Mus'ab had converted half the city of Medina to Islam. Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh is one of those people who was the chief of the Banu Aus tribe in Yathrib. He went to Mus'ab bin Umair, he talked to him. Mus'ab bin Umair gave him da'wah, and Sa'ad accepted Islam. Sa'd later on, he stood in front of his entire tribe and he asked them, what do you guys think of me? And the tribe of Sa'd said, you are a noble man. We love you. We're loyal to you. And so Sa'd told his tribe, I've taken an oath that I will not speak to any of you until you accept the religion of Islam. And so at that time, the whole of Banu Aus converted to Islam. Now, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, we also talked about how previously about how he was nearly beaten by Utbah ibn Rabi'a. During all these persecutions of the Muslims, Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, became very concerned. First the slaves, then the women, then the prominent members, elite families were being tortured. There was a strategy that Abu Jahl had built. Not a single one of these people had left Islam, no matter how severely they were tortured. So something has to be done. Abu Talib was very concerned, and he wondered how long this torture was going to prolong. How long are they going to lay hands on the beloved grandson of Abdul Muttalib, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Abu Talib was extremely worried about his nephew. He raised his nephew. He loves his nephew since he was 8 years old. And so he wants to prevent any physical harm to his nephew. So Abu Talib, he gathered together the elders of the family of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which includes Abu Jahl, because Abu Jahl is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's uncle. And he said to them that I need a promise from all of you that you will protect Muhammad. Abu Talib then recites a poem. Abu Talib was a master at poetry. His poetry moved people. And in this poem, he says that when Quraysh gathered together to protect their dignity and their honor, then Abdul Manaf, one of the families of the Quraysh, who were descendants of Manaf, protect their core and their outer arms. Meaning what, right? Meaning that they protect both the people that are at the core part of the family and also people that are remotely connected to the family. And if we are willing to protect the family of Manaf, then we need to think of one thing. Within the family of Manaf is Banu Hashim. And the most honorable and dignified men among the Banu Hashim, which is the Prophet's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, was an extremely respected member of Banu Hashim. Whether you like what Muhammad has to say or not, if you are proud of who you are and you are proud of your tribe, then you will be proud of Muhammad as a member of our proud family, because he's the grandson of Abdul Muttalib. And so the Quraysh are being called to action to protect their dignity and honor. We have never tolerated disrespect. We don't tolerate dishonor to our forefathers and our tribe. How are we going to tolerate this now? We have to be strong and fierce in defending our honor, no matter how difficult the situation becomes. We will attack anyone that dares lay a finger on our honor. Abu Talib was a smart man. His primary goal was what? To protect his nephew. And he knew that the people around him, his family members, were very tribal. So he used that tribalism to ignite a fire in them to protect his nephew, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he tells them that if someone hurts one of us, if they hurt us all. If someone spits on one of us, they spit on us all. And then he continued to emphasize the legacy of Abdul Muttalib. So all the leaders of Quraysh, in that moment, they all gave their oath to Abu Talib. That even though they do not care for the Prophet Muhammad's preaching, they will protect and defend Muhammad in the name of their family's honor. There was one person though, right? One person who did not agree. And he stormed out very angrily. Who was that person? No other than Abu Lahab. Tabbat yada Abi Lahab wa tab. He was very upset. He was very angry. He continued to torture the Muslim. He continued to harass his nephew Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abu Jahl too continued to torture and harass. But now that Abu Talib had taken this oath of his nephew's protection from his family, the Quraysh put together a convoy. They wanted to convince Abu Talib to let the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam be the exception to the rule. So what they did is they brought Abu Talib a young man by the name of Imara bin al-Walid, whose father was a very well-respected man in Mecca. Imara, he was very intelligent. He was very good in his character. He was very intelligent, very smart in trade, very good businessman. He had a lot of potential. So the Quraysh, they told Abu Talib, look, we understand Muhammad is your son, is your boy. You treat him like your son. He always showed a lot of potential. He shows a lot of good character. But we have got an offer to make for you. Let's make a trade. You see Imara right there? He's smarter. He's more loyal. He has more potential. Why don't you make Imara your successor instead? Your follower? You can do whatever you want. You can groom him. You can train him. Whatever it is that you have planned for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, then just quietly move out of the way and we'll take care of Muhammad and do what we got to do. When I tell you this is the stupidest thing I've ever read in my entire life, I'm telling you this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever read in my entire life. Because what they don't understand here is that it's not material that Abu Talib is going for. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is someone that Abu Talib loved so dearly. When you love someone, when you love something so much, you truly love them, you truly love that thing, there is nothing in the world that can take you away from it. And if there is anything in the world that can take you away from it, then you never really truly loved that thing in the first place. And although Abu Talib was not Muslim and he does not become Muslim, we can take a lesson from this. That as Muslim, our love and our loyalty belongs to Allah and His Messenger. That if there's anything that will sway us from that, then we truly never had 100% loyalty and love to the Prophet ﷺ. And we can't let anything sway us from that. But the oppressor is projecting their greed onto the subjugators. So they're bewildered that Abu Talib will not accept this deal. But they don't understand that Abu Talib is coming from a place of love and loyalty and not hate and greed. You know, it's very reminiscent when you see videos of elderly women in Gaza saying that if they gave me a castle in the Sinai desert, I would still remain in the rubble right here. Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he gave a special virtue to those who defend Al-Aqsa and the surrounding regions. He did not give a special virtue to those who are in the Sinai desert. So I will be here amongst the rubble instead of being a castle in the Sinai desert. And people read this and see this and they're bewildered. What do you mean? Don't you want to be safe? Don't you want to be secure? Don't you want to have wealth? We're giving you everything that you want. You don't know, our loyalty and our love does not belong with this wealth and greed. It belongs with Allah and His Messenger. And it has to continue that way for the preservation of this deen. And that's the legacy that the companions gave to us. So in short, Abu Talib, he was beside himself that they would even suggest this. He says, you guys have completely lost it. This is the worst thing anyone has ever said to me in my life. You guys are insulting me. This is the worst way to insult someone. Muhammad is like my child. He's my son. You think I'm going to give up my son like this? Right? So he obviously did not accept this deal. And then he goes on and he tells the Prophet ﷺ, you keep doing whatever it is that you have to do. Now these people left us a lesson. They left us a lesson. They told us to hold firm to our ground. Right? Islam is here because of the sacrifices of the companions. We think they were superhuman, but they were human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed them in that time because they were the human beings that were capable of enduring what they had to endure. And yes, they were special. But you can find similar sacrifices for the sake of the deen today. It's so heartbreaking that there's so many Muslims across the globe who are facing pain purely because they say, Rabbi Allah. That I always say that if I were to begin listing the countries, I would end up offending somebody in this room because I'm going to definitely leave one out accidentally. That's just how much there is going on. Right? We can't live in our comfort and say, oh, these sacrifices are not possible today. No, they are absolutely possible and they're happening every single day. We just have to look deeper. Look at our history. History is a very powerful weapon. Knowing your history is a very powerful weapon, which is why it's not a field that the Western societies encourage. Because had it been a field that Western society has encouraged, you would find out about the atrocities that they've committed just in the last 100 years alone, that they've been able to sweep under the rug because we teach history 1 or 2 years in high school and then you just move on. But it's a very powerful tool. And when you learn your history and you learn the history of the Muslims, you will see how many sacrifices the Muslims have made similar to this. All the moms after the fall of Andalus and the Spanish Inquisition, Muslims are being persecuted. All the moms that were teaching Quran to their kids on their basements. Or in Bosnia, they were hiding in masajid, they were hiding underground and teaching people the Quran, teaching people Islam. Or the Mongols nearly wiping out the entire Muslims, but still they were able to come out of the ashes. Everywhere you go in Islamic history, you will see people that have sacrificed in order to preserve this deen. So now the question is, what sacrifices am I going to make to ensure that this conviction, that this iman, that this yaqeen that I have in Allah and His Messenger is going to be passed down to my kids? And we think that we have to do that. And in the face of all the torture and sacrifices, the early Muslims, they stuck to their iman and their convictions. They could not be shaken. We have to internalize this. We have to reflect on this. Because how easily do we complain? How much do we cry about our situation? I'm not talking about anybody, I'm talking about me. How much do I cry about my situation? And when I complain about how difficult practicing Islam may be, I need to go back and read the stories. Just like Umar ibn Khattab would go to Khabbab ibn al-Arat whenever he felt overwhelmed. So we, the modern day Muslims, should not just learn about the Prophet Muhammad as a story and the Sahaba as a story, but we also need to understand the difficulties that they went through and put it into perspective. Right? The same Sahaba that were sacrificing a lot for their faith went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, "Oh Rasulullah, this is too much to bear. When will the help of Allah come?" Khabbab ibn al-Arat, he said this to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ replied to him and says, "You people are too hasty. You're rushing things. There were people before you who were sacrificed and tortured much more. Read your history and be inspired by your history." A ditch would be dug. A person would be put in that ditch and an axe would be taken and that person would literally be chopped in half. There would be people that would be strapped and an iron comb would be taken and the person would be skinned alive. And they never left their faith. They always remained strong. And this motivated the Sahaba to hang in there, keep working, and the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will come when the time is right. And we have nothing but shukr and gratitude that we can offer to Allah, His Messenger, and His companions for the sacrifices that they made for Islam to reach us today. That we can be here in Seattle, Washington, talking about the Prophet ﷺ, talking about his companions, and loving them with as much love as we can show, and being loyal and loving to Allah and His Messenger only. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept and do amal upon what we learned. We'll conclude today here, inshallah ta'ala. Are there any questions before we end today? Anything online? All right, tamam. Jazakallah khair, everyone. I will see you guys inshallah ta'ala next week. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursaleen. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.